Well, hello there. I didn't see you come in. Please, have a seat. Let me tell you about campaigns and elections, 'cause I'm sure you want to learn about that. Okay, so, campaigns and elections, it's on a PowerPoint, briefly go over some information so you can review. Maybe that's better, I don't know. So, it's an election year, 2014. It's the midterms. Hope everybody goes out and vote either before November 4th, Tuesday, November 4th, or on Tuesday, November 4th. If you go to the poll Wednesday, November 5th, you'll find that there are no open polls that day. Okay, so we started out just on how we decide what candidate is going to run for each party. If you've noticed, in a lot of elections, there's one Republican candidate and one Democratic candidate. Why is that the case? Well, each party has primaries. They have some sort of selection process to determine which candidate will represent them on the ticket for a position, and most times they're primaries. Elections held before the general election, the main election, which determines who each party wants for to be their candidate for that office. For example, if it's the president, the Republicans will vote in the Republican primary and the Democrats will vote in the Democratic primary and determine who will be the representative of their respective parties. That's very simplistic. It's being said simply. Something to make it a little more complicated is that there are things called open and there are things called closed primaries. Okay, so open primaries are primaries where you can choose to vote in whichever party's primary you want to. Okay, so if a primary is an open primary, think of it as each party's election is open to everybody. However, you can only vote in one party's primary. So, I am a registered unaffiliated voter. It's unaffiliated North Carolina, not independent, I'm pretty sure. I'm a registered unaffiliated voter. As a registered unaffiliated voter, I obviously don't have a political party that I would automatically sort of vote in a primary. One's primary. Luckily for me, North Carolina has open primaries. And what that means is, this is distressing. It should be. Boom. Okay. Yep. Party unaffiliated. Let's see. My voter registration card. Yay, go me. Let's see. If you fraudulently complete this form, it's a class 1 felony. Fun. Okay. Luckily I didn't do that. Hey, and if you move, change your name or your party on your voter registration card, they have a neat little thing to fill out in the inside the card. Yeah, so it's focusing great. All right. Anyway, that was fun. Unaffiliated voter, I can choose to vote in either the Democratic or Republican primary whenever that comes around. And that's fun for me because, choice is funner than no choice. Anyway, if you have a closed primary state, since I am unaffiliated, I would not be able to vote in any primary because the primary is closed to only members of that political party, of the Democratic Party for the Democratic primary, Republican Party for the Republican primary. There are open and closed states is who makes the decision on that. So North Carolina is an open primary state. There's other states that are closed primary states. And that's how that's decided. Yay, go team. Okay. Throughout American history, political history, we've had... I'm getting totally tangled up in my own cord. Okay. We've had various realignments. We call realignments where the national populace has, or the national electorate has somehow shifted significantly on an issue or with a party. So you see a realignment happen in like 1860 when Lincoln wins the presidency and Republicans become a real political party that they can, one of the two dominant political parties as opposed to being a third party. And then one of the more recent, the one where we started our modern presidential elections, was the realignment in 1932 during the Great Depression, where Democrats began to dominate the national electorate. Okay? If you look at slide 10, you can see 1928, the Democrats are just confined in the South. Essentially, mostly the old Confederacy. There are reasons for that. Because it's the South and it's the old Confederacy. Democrats were not the party of Lincoln, those dastardly Republicans that totally freed the slaves and stuff and waged the war of northern aggression. Southern Democrats, meaning white people, were still sore about that issue and have been sore about that issue for a very, very long time. So why is the South Democratic, other than the fact that we got the party of Lincoln? Republicans are still, or were, and say more fiscally, governmentally conservative than the liberals are. So the South is full of poor people and no industrial base, right? So the South is poor. It's not doing great, and Democrats win there because they have a populist message that offers some help to the downtrodden, where the Republicans have a message that speaks to merchants, business, captains of industry, more than anything else. However, 3 years into the Great Depression, it's 1932, nothing's happening, everybody needs some help. Democrats sweep this country fairly easily. You see this again with FDR in 1936, 1940, 1944, 1948. We have Harry Truman beating Thomas Dewey, despite the fact that Strom Thurmond runs a Southern Democrat campaign, and win some states and a lot of votes down there. So here's what happened during that election, and this is sort of the beginning of that shift from Democratic control, where the Republicans were able to find an opening to, later on, where they would become relevant again. So the Democrats in 1948 officially adopted just a minor change in their political party's platform that said that they supported integration. Wasn't a super major indication of support, but it was some support. And Southern Democrats just left the convention. Once that was voted in, they walked out. Boycotted and had their own convention. Ran on the ticket known as the Dixiecrats, with Strom Thurmond as their presidential candidate. And like I said, won some states, but Harry Truman still ultimately prevailed. 1952 and 1956, Dwight Eisenhower wins those elections. You still have that Southern Democratic base. Dwight Eisenhower wins because he's a super popular general from World War II, and the Soviet Union is exploding nuclear weapons all over the place, and people are afraid. Eisenhower is also a very he's a very liberal Republican. He's like, a lot of big government programs, a lot of government spending, government help, Social Security. He has no desire to end Social Security or Medicare or anything like that. He in fact strengthens those programs. Eisenhower would be the ideal Democrat today. So when you see that the whole country votes for Eisenhower, that's not a repudiation of FDR's New Deal politics, of the liberal economic shift in the nation. As a matter of fact, the fact that Eisenhower supported those things shows how strong those policies sort of had cemented themselves as the status quo in America, those social programs and such. We'll move forward to 1964. We see a change. Something weird happens. Barry Goldwater runs, and he wins the South, and LBJ wins the rest of the nation. That's weird, because the Republicans have never, ever, ever won the Deep South. Democrats have completely dominated that, but for the first time, we have that switch. So what happens? The whole thing was set up, or a lot of it was set up by that 1948, but then move forward a little bit to 1958. George Wallace, Democrat, Alabama, runs for governor against another Democrat because it's Alabama. Democrats are popular in the Deep South. There is no Republican running for governor. It's just two Democrats running against each other for governor of Alabama. George Wallace talks about social programs, healthcare, education, Social Security, providing food to the poor, housing assistance, healthcare, those sort of, utopian liberal dreams. The other Democratic candidate runs on a segregation platform. He runs completely and totally only on let's keep the black people out of the white people's area. And George Wallace loses. despite the fact that he is more in tune with the voters in terms of what they want economically. He is much closer to where the voters are. Just sort of all over the board, actually. It's just that he doesn't run around talking about how much he hates black people. So he's realizes he lost because of this racial issue and says, I won't let this happen again to me. And he runs in 1962 solely on segregation. Forget that social program, help the poor, help, poor people and middle class people stuff. Nobody cares about that. I'm going to run purely on segregation. And he wins that election decisively. That was 1962. Republicans are realizing that maybe they can win the South on this race issue. Also, they realize, just like George Wallace does, that they can win the entire country on this race issue. So, 1964 comes along, Barry Goldwater runs against the New Deal, runs around and says Social Security, Medicare, etc. are the worst things ever. He gets jeered by crowds all over the place. People think he's a monster. The New Deal, liberalism has won. But he wins the South because even though he runs around and tells Southern voters everything they do not want to hear economically, politically, anything at all, he says, oh, by the way, I'll let you keep your segregation. Southern white voters respond, and they vote for him. Lyndon Baines Johnson wins the rest of the country, but Republicans now have an opening in the South. And Nixon exploits that opening by winning 1968 in a close election. Splits the Southern vote with that racial politics. And then wins in 1972 on law and order and on, those counterculture people, the scary black people that have been trying to get their rights and breaking the law, and you should vote for me because I'm not like those people. And also on hippies, they have like drugs, and that's bad. So he wins that election, and Republicans say, hey, race works everywhere in the nation. Everybody's racist. Democrats eventually learn this lesson also and are not afraid to take up sort of racial politics to win elections, even though they're a little more subtle about it. And while Democratic policies in the end are way more friendly to non-white people, and while the Republicans are openly hostile, the Democrats are still able to win a few elections by engaging in sort of that race baiting politics at a tiny level, depending on who the candidate is. That's kind of the big lesson for the early to, from the beginning of what we covered to the 1990s. Race is kind of a big deal in elections. There are other issues too, obviously. What the economic conditions are, foreign policy conditions, if the candidate is likable or not. But Nixon is an infinitely unlikable person. But he still dominates elections. He's got it going on. So he wins elections. Bush and Dukakis. Dukakis is a little weird, but it's not like Bush is Reagan or anything. So, anyway. Election years. Let's go through this stuff. It's fun. So, president is elected every 4 years. Every single member of the House of Representatives is elected every 2 years. And each senator is elected every 6 years, with 1/3 of the Senate being up for election every 2 years. So the Senate is constitutionally staggered so that in 1 2-year period, one election, 2014, there are 33, 34 senators up for re-election. Then 2016, there'll be 33 or 34. Then 2018, there'll be 33 or 34. Then 2020, 33, 34 senators up for re-election, etc. The presidential elections are important, that they happen every 4 years, and they're known as presidential elections. The president being on the ballot has a big impact on how the election goes. The president being on the ballot draws more people to the polls. More people go out and vote. Simple, right? Because the president's on the ballot and because voter turnout is higher, that is generally better for Democrats. When there's higher voter turnout, that's generally better for the Democrats. Now, in between presidential elections, they happen every 4 years. There's an election 2 years after a presidential election, or, depending on how you want to look at it, 2 years before a presidential election. Such as this year. There is an election in 2012 where we chose a president. There'll be election in 2016 when we choose a president. What are we doing here in 2014? Well, we're voting for every single member of the House of Representatives, and we're voting for 1/3 of the Senate. The elections, like this one, that happen every 2 years, that's not a presidential election, that is not a presidential election, are called midterm elections. Midterm elections have lower voter turnout than the presidential elections, and therefore are generally a little more favorable to Republicans. Now, these are just general rules, general trends. Again, the conditions of the country matter. Whichever party's controls the White House matters for how the elections go. But in general, that's the rule. Talk about that in a second. There are other elections that nobody goes and votes on. These are elections that happen in odd number years, so 2013, 2015, 2017. Lots of times these are local elections, so your school board, your city council, your mayor. Sometimes these elections happen in months like March or like June, not in November. And the farther away you get from November of an even year, from either November or an even year, the less people that come out to vote. So March on an odd year is a very low voter turnout time. People aren't thinking about an election then. It's an odd year, and March is way away from November. Now you have November in an odd year, at least people are like, oh, November. Maybe I guess there could be an election. It's weird that there's an election on an odd year, November, but November's the time to go and vote. But if you have an election in March of an odd year, people are like, was that constitutional? Can you actually have elections in March? Yes, you can. Those get the lowest voter turnout. So, presidential elections, you're looking at roughly 60% of all of all eligible voters get out and vote. In the midterm elections, you have between 33 and 40% of eligible voters vote. And when you have off-year elections, elections in March or May, or you have primaries, the voter turnout is often 25% at most. Generally less than 25%, lots of times in the teens. Occasionally you may get single-digit eligible voter turnout. So if you want your vote to matter, vote in March of an odd year. So we talked about turnout affects results. A higher turnout means Democratic advantage. Lower turnout means Republican advantage, broadly speaking. What affects voter turnout? Well, the harder it is to vote, the lower their turnout will be, the advantage to Republicans. The easier it is to vote, the higher the turnout will be, advantage Democrats. So, if you need to go through, let's say, multiple layers of bureaucracy to get a voter registration card or a voter ID, that makes it harder to vote, and then you'll have a lower voter turnout and a Republican advantage. If you need to register to vote a month or a month and a half before an election, it'll be more difficult for people to register to vote, and you'll have lower voter turnout and you'll have a Republican advantage. If you have same-day voter registration, that makes it very easy for people to vote, because people who aren't registered can go and vote can go and register and then vote the day of the election. That leads to higher voter turnout because it doesn't keep people away from the polls, and that gives Democrats an advantage in the election. If you have things like voter registration when people get a driver's license or a photo ID, you get automatically registered when you do that. That leads to higher voter turnout and a Democratic advantage. If you have more polling places or more poll workers or more polling booths, you can get a higher voter turnout because it's easier to vote, it takes less time, you can get to the polls easier, Democratic advantage. The less voting booths you have, the less polling places you have, the longer it takes to vote, the lower the turnout will be, the Republican advantage. It's interesting or good maybe to keep this in mind whenever there are changes in the voter laws. Not saying people don't have, pure ideological reasons for supporting some laws over another. Ideological is not a bad word in this case. It's, what your core values are, beliefs are, regardless of who it helps. Ideological views are a good thing in this case. But oftentimes people make voter laws for partisan reasons. That would be the bad reasons, to just favor your party over another. So think to yourself, would you prefer to have laws that make it easy for people to vote, that increase voter turnout? Is it a good thing if we have high voter turnout in America? Is it a shame that we have 60% voter turnout when every other country in the Western industrialized world has more than that? If you think of that in the abstract, don't think about which party it helps or hurts. That would be your ideological reason for, not saying this right. If you like that, that would be an ideological reason to support it. If you think to yourself, higher voter turnout means Democrats win, that would be a partisan reason. So if you're like, I support same-day registration because, it increases voter turnout, but secretly, more Democrats will vote, you're being partisan. If you don't care who it helps, it's ideological. Maybe a little pure reason to support a voter law. Now, photo ID laws, things like that make it more difficult to vote, make it more expensive to vote, give Republicans an advantage. Of course, a lot of Americans support voter ID laws. Think it's common sense that when you go to vote, you should prove who you are by showing a photo ID. Gives Republicans advantage, but can be an ideological reason to support that, because again, common sense, right? Quote unquote common sense. But yeah, so that's how turnout affects results, and also how the various laws affect election results. We've talked about the midterms, this midterm. So whichever party's in the White House, that generally means that party will do not very well in a midterm election. So if a Republican is in the White House during the midterm election, when a Republican occupies the White House, that gives the Democrats a little bit of a natural bump in terms of how well they'll do. If a Democrat's in the White House, that'll give the Republicans a little bit of a natural bump in terms of how well they'll do. Democrat in the White House, Republicans will have that little extra bump in this 2014 election. Now, it's also a midterm election, which gives the Republicans another natural little bump, right? Finally, during this election, we have more Democratic seats that are up for re-election than Republican seats, which means the Democrats have more seats to lose. That gives the Republicans a little bit of an advantage. We're talking about the Senate here. Sorry. The House is so gerrymandered at this point, these elections don't matter. So there are more Democratic seats up for re-election, which means the Democrats have more to lose, which means a slight Republican advantage there. The one other thing that's really going to hurt Democrats in this year's election is that the Democrats that are up for re-election in the Senate won their Senate seats first in 2008, when you had that record high Democratic voter turnout, that wave election for the Democrats, where Obama won the presidency, and won states like Indiana. Democrats won in states they probably should not have won in, theoretically, because of how red the states are. So now the Democrats have to pay this year for winning states that ordinarily wouldn't vote for them. So you have Democrats in Alaska that are going to have a difficult time. Kay Hagan, North Carolina here, while it's becoming slightly more blue state, it's still on the lean red side of blue, or of purple. Purple meaning it's straight down the middle. It's on the red side of purple a little bit. You got Louisiana and Arkansas, which have Democratic candidates. Louisiana has become more red over the past 10 years. And Arkansas, for some reason in 2008, there was not a Republican that ran against Mark Pryor, the Democrat in Arkansas. So he's in trouble. Talked about Alaska. Iowa is a toss-up state. It's leaning on the blue side of purple in presidential elections, but it's still a really strange toss-up state with very sort of populist Midwestern progressive Democrats and like evangelical displaced Southern Baptists. So that's why you have such a close election by a Tea Party Republican and a sort of normal Democrat. Seriously, like Joni Ernst, I've talked about maybe in some classes how much I love her. She's, castrates pigs and cleans up messes in Washington, again with pigs. But her policies are far, far, far to the right of the entire nation. Go look up some of her policies and some of the things she said. They're kind of amazing. But she's got that folksy charm, which is so awesome. Anyway, that election's close, even though there's a Democrat, or there was a Democrat in that state beforehand. So lots of things like that. Take a look at the exit polls. Pay attention to things like the breakdown of the vote. How many white voters were there? How many black voters were there? How many Latino voters were there? What percentage of the vote that was, and which candidate won what percentage of that vote. How did the gender break down? Or how did the gender vote break down? Is that something to say? How much of the electorate was female? How much of the electorate was male? And how did they vote? Did women make up most of the voters? And did women vote mostly for Democrats? Yes and yes. Something to look at, though. Familiarize yourself with how much. Like, what was the... Did Democrats win women voters, let's see, by 10% or 15%? Look it up. Vote by gender. In 2012, Obama won the female vote 55% to 44%, and women made up 53% of the electorate. When you're looking at predicting out elections, looking at polls, seeing how, what candidates need to do to win an election, how they're going to appeal to different voting blocks, which is something we'll get into a little more. Public policy voting block, meaning the women voting block or the male voting block. If Mitt Romney would have actually, so that woman vote, Obama won it by 11%. If Mitt Romney would have made that vote a 53% to 46% vote, so if he would have just narrowed that gap of women voters, or the gap that he lost by, if he was able to appeal to just 2% more women, he might have won the election. If Obama would have been able to close his loss among men by a percentage point or two, that would have given him a much bigger victory. So that's some of the things we look at. There was an article I read recently, as in a couple of hours ago, where a Republican pollster was suggesting that Republicans needed to win a minimum of 64% of the white vote to have a chance to win the election in 2014. So the Republicans need to win 64% of the white vote. Democrats could win 36% of the white vote. And if that happens, then the Republican candidate for president has a chance at winning the election. The problem is that while Republicans dominate the white vote comparatively, winning 64% of the white vote has not happened for them in a very long time. Mitt Romney won 59% of the white vote in 2012. So the Republicans would have to improve their advantage over the Democrats among white voters by 5 points. And that's going to be difficult, especially if the Democrats especially if the Democrats have a white person heading their ticket in 2016, as opposed to somebody who is not white, because you'll have more white voters coming back to the party when that happens. Anyway, if you compare George Bush's victory over John Kerry among Latino voters and Obama's victory over McCain and Romney, and the Latino vote breakdown in each of those elections, so Obama won the Latino vote 71% to 27% in 2012, whereas Bush lost the Latino vote still, but he lost it something like 45% to 55% or 40% to 60%. Neither party, these voting blocks that traditionally go for one party or another, the Republicans don't have to win the Latino vote to win an election. They just need to narrow the margin of victory. The Democrats don't need to win the white vote to win an election. They just need to narrow the margin of victory for the Republicans. All right. A way to look at votes. I have maps on there, some videos, campaign videos you should watch for a number of different reasons. If you look at the notes on these PowerPoint slides, so open it up, not in a slideshow view, but where you can see the note pages, you'll see that maybe I've written some stuff down there. Connecticut's CT, but I made it CN because I was just making notes to myself. You'll see that if you read the note pages. Okie dokie. I think that's all I'll go over. Excuse me. Hope this was helpful. If very quick overview. I spent a long time on it in class, but lots of time here because it's getting an overview. If you have any questions, you know where to find me. I did just show everybody my address, I realized. Google North Carolina State Board of Education. Scratch that. Google North Carolina State Board of Elections. If you Google that, you can type in your name and the county you registered in, or your name and nothing else, or your name and your birthday. Basically, search. Alright, and you can find yourself, and you can find your voter registration stuff. You can find out what party you registered in, what address you're registered under. You can get your sample ballot. You can see what elections you've voted in before, in the past. You can look up my information. You can see where I live. You can see which party I'm registered as. You can see my voter history. You can't see who I voted for, but you can probably guess who I voted for. But you can see which elections I voted in. You can look up your neighbors. You can look up other people in the class. All public information. Look up other professors. Have you ever wondered if your psychology teacher is a Democrat or a Republican? They might be registered to vote, and they might be registered as a party. So yeah, fun times. Go team. Have fun stalking people on the State Board of Elections website. And I'll talk to you later.